Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kate O'Keefe. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I cover US-China issues from our Washington bureau. And I am joined by an amazing cast here. We've got Senator Joni Ernst, a Republican from Iowa. We've got Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, a Democrat from Florida. We have Admiral Phil Davidson, the head of INDOPACOM, and we have General Hawk. First ask all of you, how does the US's economic relationship with China impact our national security interests? And I'll start with you, Senator Ernst.
Okay, thank you, Kate, and thanks to the audience for coming out today. It is a pleasure to be on the panel with so many distinguished members. When it comes to trade, economics, national security, from my perspective, an Iowa farm girl, and what are Iowans thinking about this? A lot of folks will think that middle America, they don't really pay attention to China and security concerns, and what does that matter to their daily lives? But our farmers in Iowa, of course, have a vested interest in China, as do our manufacturers, but I'll use our farmers for an example. Understanding that their agricultural goods go into so many different markets, so they keep an eye on that. And of course, China is a large purchaser of corn, soybeans, pork, you name it, from Iowa. So there is a direct connection between China and Iowa. 1 in 5 jobs in Iowa is tied to trade. So when we talk about national security, what are we doing in that space, and how does it tie into trade and Iowa? Well, just for example, doing the freedom of navigation exercises through the South China Sea, where so many of our trade goods will proceed, that directly impacts how we get our goods into various markets around the globe. So having free and open trade lanes applies directly to trade in Iowa, and of course then our national security. So we can't be complicit about security. Good trade partners, good security partners, we need to work on both of those with China.
Thank you so much. Congresswoman Murphy, please.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here, and also just really honored to be on this panel with a distinguished panelists. I think there are actually quite a few areas in which the US-China trade wars has a significant impact on national security, not just in this moment, but into the future. I would say first and foremost, China had already been seeking its tech independence. And I guess, maybe for the first time at a Reagan Defense Forum, I'm going to quote Gwyneth Paltrow and say that this conscious decoupling of our economies actually is creating a situation where you're accelerating China's tech independence. And as they create their own technologies and move from imitator to innovator, I think we'll find that some of the defense industrial base will find more competition in some of these products out in the marketplace as China pushes forward with their versions of various technologies. I think that is a bit dangerous also because China's approach to technology is not technology for democratization purposes, but it's rather technology for an authoritarian dystopian purpose. Just look no further than Xinjiang or Hong Kong and you can see that. So that competition and the competition of the values that are embodied within technology will have a significant impact on our national security. I'll also say that the current trade war is affecting, I would argue that it is affecting China's cooperation, perhaps, with us on some really important issues, whether it's North Korea or otherwise. And it has the ability to pull in issues on this side of the Pacific. For example, I think the president is keen to try to land softly phase one, de-escalation of this trade war. And there was some consideration that after the Congress passed the Hong Kong sanctions, that he wouldn't sign them into law as a way not to further inflame the Chinese as he's trying to negotiate out of this trade war. So that would be, it was a veto-proof majority that we passed the Hong Kong sanctions with, but we don't want to see ourselves selling out other American values in an effort to get out of a trade war that we started. I could go on. There are other areas that you see the impact, but I'll finish with this last one, is that 1.4 billion Chinese people who are seeing a deceleration of their economy, and their government is blaming it on us. And so what does that do to stoke nationalist feelings within China, as well as anti-Americanism? And in that context, the relationship between the two countries in the event of conflicts or misunderstandings becomes very, I think, risky.
Okay, thank you so much. Admiral, could you tell us how you think the U.S.'s economic relationship with China impacts our national security interests?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate, and as well, it's a great honor to be up here with the members here on the panel. I appreciate the comments so far. Without question, I believe that economic prosperity is linked to our national security, and I believe that most countries see their security and economic interests intertwined. You only need to look back at the history of the United States. One of our oldest treaty alliances was signed in the 1830s with Thailand. It was a treaty of amity, and it was to help facilitate the deep trade that the very young United States had in Southeast Asia at the time. That's just one example. Commodore Matthew Perry's opening of Japan in the 1850s as well shows that the nation's national security interests and apparatus were trying to help assist in the economic prosperity. I appreciate the comments on freedom of navigation operations. We've talked quite frequently about the amount of trade. In excess of $3 trillion in trade traverses the South China Sea waterway on an annual basis. There's some $2.5 trillion worth of reserves in the seabed. One of the things that we seldom talk about is the telecommunication cables that terminate in the South China Sea, carry information from Southeast Asia and South Asia, and indeed the Middle East and Southwest Asia, all the way to the United States, and certainly to other centers there in Asia as well. Critically important. And assuring that those cables are free from disruption, certainly. And I think for all our allies and partners, helping assure that they're free from coercion. And that manifests itself in the region in many ways, from China specifically. In the diplomatic realm, certainly propaganda and information, but in the economic aspect as well. From the Belt and Road Initiative and its very pernicious approach to development in the region, the challenges it's presented for many of the countries in terms of their ability to remit the funds, in terms of the quality of the work, in terms of the corruption that goes with it, in terms of some of the lack of viability in these projects. It's challenging some nations directly and their sovereignty. And you've all read about Sri Lanka and Vanuatu here in the last year. I think it's very, very important that people recognize what occurred in Tuvalu, a very small Pacific Island nation just here in the last few weeks. Tuvalu is a small nation with a $40 million GDP. They have rejected a $400 million offering from China to come in and build infrastructure, levees, and other things because Tuvalu is concerned about the sovereignty of its territory, its ability to control what China's true intentions are, and its way ahead. 10 times the amount of their annual GDP has been rejected. So you can see how economic prosperity and national security is so intertwined. Thank you. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you so much. General, could we hear from you, please?
Sure, thanks, Kate. And again, I'd like to say it's an honor to be on the panel with the folks and to be here. And I agree with everything that was said. And I'd like to reiterate a couple of things Admiral Davidson said. I think everybody's got to be fully aware of what China's intentions are. And it's a globalization that we're undergoing. We understand that. But as was said, if you remember in September 9/11, right? Remember what happened in 2001, which is often forgotten. December of that same year, 2001, is when China was admitted to the WTO. And so they got into the WTO, and we had a strategic focus on the Middle East from 2001 for several years. And what the Chinese did was they used lawfare to their advantage. And on the economic side, they would use the WTO when it suited them, and they would disregard the rules when it didn't, lawfare, as it were. The estimate today is $600 billion a year is stolen from the United States via intellectual property theft and cyber theft. The predatory loan practices and coercive business practices inside of China, again, are disregarding the WTO and using it to their advantage. So the idea that you could separate economy with national security, that it doesn't happen. It's an element of national power, just like diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And so I couldn't agree more with Admiral Davidson. As we look at this as we go forward, the trade war is not ending. Even if we have a deal, the trade war is not ending. There's going to be competition, as far as I can see, and they're going to continue to try to change the rules to suit them, and they're going to try to change the post-World War II order, and they're going to use lawfare and everything else available to do that. So I just think we have to be eyes wide open when we look at what's going on with respect to the Chinese.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear from the Senator and the Congresswoman about President Trump's China tariffs. I'd like to hear from both of you, I guess starting with you, Senator Ernst. Do you think the President's tariffs on Chinese goods are helping or hurting U.S. national security interests?
You bet. The President and I go round and round over the tariff issue, and every time I visit with him about the China trade issue, he always starts the conversation. He's like, Joni, I know you don't like tariffs, but I'm a tariff guy. And I'm like, yes, Mr. President, I understand. Typically, I don't like tariffs, but it is a tool in the President's toolbox. And the President has been able to bring China to the table for negotiations by using the tools available to him, 301 tariffs. And so we have China at the table, and I would say that this trade war with China, this is me, Joni Ernst speaking, but I would say it's long overdue. And our farmers in Iowa, you hear all the hubbub in the media, but our farmers in Iowa, when I visit with them, they say, I get why the President is doing this, and we are hurting. They are feeling the pinch from these tariffs. But we get why the President is doing this. And I had one farmer at the end of a round table. He got up, he slammed his hand on the table, and he said, what I don't get is why we didn't have a president stand up for us before this. The Chinese have treated the American farmer abominably for decades. And so, as one member of the Iowa Soybean Association said, Joni, the tariff issue and the pinch we feel from this is no different than the pain we have felt from China 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So please understand when we're talking about the tariffs, we may not like them, but they are bringing China to the table. And if we can get a better deal out of this for our American farmers and manufacturers, I think we need to try it. So the American farmer, they're still with President Trump on this, and it does apply to our national security. And again, my perspective on this panel is from an agricultural perspective, and that is one of the most hard-hit industries right now. But understanding that China has a lot of folks to feed, and they need to import those agricultural goods. They're coming to the table. That's why phase one of the deal will be based on agriculture. So hopefully we can bring our countries together. solidify phase one, get it done, and start removing some of these tariffs. Again, I'm not a huge fan, but I think they have brought China to the table.
Just a really quick follow-up before we move on to you, Congresswoman. Senator Ernst, do you think there's a breaking point for Iowa farmers? I mean, it sounds like they've been pretty patient so far, but how long can this go on? I mean, it seems like the president seems to believe the U.S. can wait China out, but is there sort of a firm breaking point where you think the farmers would actually turn against this policy?
I think there, at some point, will have to be a breaking point, but they haven't indicated at what point that is. What they are indicating to me is, Joni, we need to see a light at the end of the table, or at the end of the tunnel. We just have to do that. But we do have other trade deals that are ongoing that will be very beneficial to our farmers. USMCA, which is sitting in the House right now, would be very beneficial to our farmers. And if we could move on that and get some of these other trade deals done, it would help provide leverage in closing the deal with China as well.
Makes a lot of sense, thank you. Congresswoman Murphy, could you give us your opinion on if the tariffs are helping or hurting our national security interests?
I hear an awful lot from small businesses and constituents in my district about the tax that they are paying because tariffs are a tax. They're a tax on American businesses and American consumers. So anybody who says differently is being misleading about it. But the people who are paying those taxes are very clear about the pain that they are enduring and suffering as a result of the China trade policy. And as a result, I wanted to get a better sense of what the impact was across across the country as far as the China trade. So I hosted a briefing last month on U.S.-China trade and had a variety of experts. I think the general consensus was that they agreed China behaves badly. There are state-led economic policies that we want to correct, structural changes that need to happen. And so everyone is in agreement on that. I think the piece that people have a bit of depart from the president is whether or not this blunt force tool, tariffs, and a go-it-alone tariff strategy is really achieving any of the aims and not causing more economic pain for the U.S. than progress in the U.S.-China trade relationship. And I would say that because the president has launched the trade war with China in the midst of trade conflict all across the globe, we don't have our allies working together with us, applying the pressure on China. And so what China has done is, while we apply broad based tariffs, and we're at four tranches of tariffs now, if we go into the next tranche here in the next couple of weeks, we will have applied tariffs to every single Chinese export. While what the Chinese have done in their counter tariff strategy is that they've identified very specific industries, and they have also lowered the trade barriers with other countries so that those countries are sort of displacing and softening the blow on their own economy. So they have used a scalpel and we have used a sledgehammer against our own American businesses and American consumers, and we're doing it without the partnership of our allies. And to date, while there's been a lot of talk and tweets about a deal being imminent, it's unlikely that that's going to be done anytime soon to provide the much-needed relief to American consumers and American businesses.
I just wanted to follow up with you a little bit. I mean, earlier you mentioned that we started this trade war. I feel like that could be a sort of interesting subject to debate, and I'm just wondering if you have any constituents who are actually sympathetic to the tariffs, despite them maybe being, Democratic voters and maybe not really being keen on the president. Have you noticed anyone sort of going against the grain on that?
Well, so I have a business owner in my district. He does aftermarket auto parts, I guess, and so his company has been in my district for over 20 years. And while he supports the idea of forcing China to make structural changes, it is likely that he can't continue to sustain 25% taxes on the products that he's bringing in. It's having substantial impact on him. And there's no sense as to where is this going and when will it end. So, again, I think there's broad consensus that China was a bad actor in its economic policies. Structural changes needed to happen. The approach by which we're doing this, and whether or not we're actually seeing any progress despite all of the pain that's being incurred.
Thank you very much. Admiral Davidson, just gonna lighten things up here. How does Huawei's rise as a global telecommunications giant impact your strategy in the Indo-Pacific?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part, please.
How does Huawei's rise as a big telecom giant impact your strategy in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, it's a bit of a concern. One of the things I've done in just the last few weeks is spent some time with the tech industry and telecommunications as well. And what Huawei is doing, at state direction and opportunity is offering extraordinarily cheap goods that other nations can't necessarily compete with. That's a challenge. Secondly is the cybersecurity and other laws, national security laws that are in place in China make Huawei a specific threat because Huawei is obligated to provide information to the Communist Party of China as the Communist Party of China dictates. And as I think about our allies and partners, indeed, everyone on the nation, and the potential for their information to be subject to Communist Party of China whim, I think that's an extreme threat. To have such networks and systems that would be perhaps interoperable or even interconnected with the United States military systems or other specific systems, you really have to question the integrity of what those networks would be. And it would, in a way, define the relationships that we have with others and allies and partners. And fundamentally, that's what many of our engagements have been about. This is why competition is so important globally. It's not the U.S.'s intent, in my view, to see it decouple from China. What it wants is a China that plays by the rules. And when I meet with industry in all sectors, there's two things that become eminently clear. One is they want access to the Chinese market, and they're happy to have businesses that they're involved with in China, have access to the global economy as well. But secondly, they need China to play by the rules. And finding the leverage to ensure that China plays by the rules as part of this global economy is, I think, a national security concern for the United States, and indeed an economic prosperity concern for really the whole of the globe.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. General Carlisle, do you think it was a good decision to put Huawei on the entity list?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I couldn't agree more with what Admiral Davidson said. It is a huge challenge because there's cyber threats, there's intellectual property thefts, there's coercive business practices. It's nice to have the ability to work inside of China, but if they demand all your intellectual property and then they turn it into their own uses, it is a challenge. I think the Huawei ZTE thing, it's something that had to be done for national security. But there's a couple of points to it. One is it's not easy. I think, if you talk to industry and certainly the tech industry, phase 1 of 889 was this year, August of this year. Phase 2, which means we couldn't go directly to anybody that had to do with Huawei ZTE. And then next year it's supposed to be down the entire supply chain. That's hard to determine. And as Admiral Davidson said, we know what the Chinese have done. They dump a market, they undercut us, they undercut tons of businesses with state-sponsored capitalism where they can undercut, and then they grab the market, and then they control it, and then they have you over the barrel, whether it's technologically or whether it's militarily. So they use that to their advantage. So I think the two things, yes, the short answer is yes, it was the right thing to do, but I think there's two things we have to realize how difficult it may be for industry and what the challenges industry are going to have to meet those regulations. And we may need things like Defense Production Act, DPA, Title III, and some of those things to help industry counter what the Chinese have done. So I think that's part of it. And then the other part of it, and it's exactly what Congresswoman Murphy said, is it's not us, it's all of us. And so I think our asymmetric advantage against that adversary is the fact that we have friends, partners, and allies. So it can't be us go it alone. We're the only ones that are going to, push back against Huawei and ZTE. It's got to be, we got to build allies and partners and an agreement across all the nations that have the same values as us to do exactly what we've all said, and that is force the Chinese to play by the rules. And they'll give an inch, and then they'll try to take two back, because they'll play the long game, and we have to stay resolute and continuing to push back on that.
So I consistently, hear complaints from U.S. companies who do business with Huawei that putting them on the entity list was a big mistake and potentially an own goal, because it's incentivizing U.S. companies to move production overseas so that they can continue doing business with Huawei and not be subjected to entity list restrictions. And the other thing that I've heard from industry is that this move could push Huawei to try even harder to become more self-sufficient and really stop relying on US companies at all. And so I guess I'm wondering, do you think that that's sort of just a self-serving view from US companies, and that they should sort of be willing to bear some of the pain that might be necessary to get some of these Chinese companies in line? Or do you think that they have some merit in those points, and that our strategy is maybe not quite fine-tuned enough?
So the fine-tuning the detail, again, I think that was said by everybody on the panel, is we've got to be very diligent, and we've got to be very understanding of the challenges and second, third order effects and unintended consequences. So I couldn't agree more. The idea that we would drive the Chinese into developing their own capability, they're trying to do that anyway. We're not driving them into anything. They'll either steal it or send their students to our schools to learn how to do it and go back and do it themselves. They're going to try to get to total independence. So the idea that we're pushing them into developing capability they weren't going to go after anyway, I don't agree with that. I do agree with the challenge that we face, and the challenge being that, and that's why I kind of referenced DPA Title III and some of those other things. I do think that we collectively, not just the United States, but friends, partners, and allies with us, have got to understand that to have leverage to push the Chinese to follow the rules, it's going to take a concerted effort, and in some cases it's going to take the case where we pay a little bit more for something, because we don't allow them to undercut the market and gain that market, totally control of that market. So the idea that we push things offshore outside the United States, as long as it's a friend, partner, or ally, that's okay. We're a global defense industrial base today. We make great equipment, but we are global, and so I think that is probably less of an issue. But I still think that we have to push back on Huawei and ZTE, and the enemy list was one way to do it. But it's going to take, there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more understanding that's going to go to it as we move forward.
Thank you. So my next question, I'm hoping to get a response from everyone here on the stage. It seems like one of the most important topics of the day, at least in Washington, this concept of China's military civil fusion policy. And so, I'm sure everyone's familiar with this. It's basically a Chinese government policy that mandates that Chinese civilian entities help the PLA. And so what my question is for everyone is, what are the implications for US firms and universities that are doing business in China? Is there any way to ensure that these entities will not be helping the Chinese military in the process?
Short answer is no. No. If their work, and it all goes to the Chinese government and the Chinese military. We were talking to Mr. Dana Deasy, from the CIO for the Pentagon last night, and he was talking about one of the factors is that, in AI is an example. In artificial intelligence, you obviously have to have the technical capability to write the algorithms and understand how you make that work. But as importantly, you have to have the data, and you have to have massive amounts of data. And the Chinese collect that on their own people and on their own industries and on their own, they have a massive, because they have no restrictions. So they collect a massive amount of data our values don't allow that and shouldn't allow that, but that's gonna, when it comes to AI, as they start, hopefully our advantage will still be the technical capability to understand the algorithmic warfare that we have to do to defeat them, but they have the benefit of data collection across 1.4 billion people, plus all the visitors and all the foreign companies and everybody else is there, and that'll give them the advantage. So the civil-military fusion, state-sponsored capitalism is what it is, in a mercantile mentality, and Belt and Road's an example of it. The Made in China 2025 is an example of it. They're going to do everything in their power. We just have to go into that fully understanding what their intentions are and then devise hopefully very good strategies to move forward to counter that and push back to continue to drive them to go by, to follow the rules and the rule of law.
Thank you, Kate, for the question. I'm sorry, Senator.
No, go ahead, Adam.
Thank you. I agree with General Carlisle. I mean, the first step in problem solving is understanding the problem and getting our university and research institutes to, understand the depth of the intellectual property theft, the outright stealing of the international businesses' patent rights and other things to China's benefit, and then to have China's state-directed funds, accelerate the research and development on initiatives that have begun in the United States or in other nations on the world is a real threat and a challenge. The evidence is out there. We know from our own engagements over the years with the Chinese that the operations on the flight deck of their newest carriers, they have the same colored jerseys and all the same hand motions that we use because they took that from us, and that was never part of the training regime. And this is happening in the tech community. Interestingly, across the whole of the region, I would say all nations are seeking to be an innovator and to be tech leaders. And it's going to both benefit and strain university resources and the talent pool that's available to do all these things. And I think it's critically important that the United States compete. Over the last 70-odd years, we have been the global innovator when it comes to tech, telecommunications, space, satellites. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Having an economic environment where some nations don't have to play by the rules would work to the detriment of our global leadership in innovation and ultimately our economic position on the globe. I don't think anybody in this country wants to go back 70 years on their own prosperity, given the benefits that have been derived from that innovation going forward.
Certainly. I was just going to state as well that while we do have issues with the fusion in China, we also have to look what's going on here in the United States as well, with the number of exchange programs and students that we have that are being educated in our own university system, going on to work at our industries here in the United States, and then taking that information back to China or just communicating it back to China. This is an issue. We look at foreign money coming into various universities and projects, and we are not scrutinizing as a federal government the types of monies that are coming into our university system, those that are establishing certain centers of excellence for advanced students. We don't pay attention like we should to those dollars that are coming into the United States and what are they getting in exchange for those dollars here. So it is something that has been brought to the attention of the Department of Education, and it is something that we are looking into. But not only do we have that situation in China, but now we have those students here that are being raised in our educational institutions, going on to work in wonderful industries here in the United States, but then communicating the intellectual property and trade secrets back to China. We do need to pay attention to that.
I would also add that, you know, while civil military fusion gives them an advantage, and it's not something that in a market-based economy we would be able to do here, but I wonder if there isn't a way to cultivate what I call corporate patriotism, right? What role, what responsibility do U.S. companies have in helping us implement and secure our national security and our foreign policy in their choices of what they choose to do? And so can we cultivate a culture of corporate patriotism? And I think we're a little bit far from that at this moment, because we have U.S. companies who are, because of the, I guess, employee activism, are unwilling to even do business with our own Department of Defense, whereas they do business overseas. So there's a bit of cultural work that I think needs to be done.
Definitely. So I also wanted to hear from everyone, do you think that the U.S. is doing enough to support Uyghurs and Hong Kongers? And, you know, should the U.S., you know, if we're taking this moral stance on, you know, promoting our values around the world, should the U.S. be contemplating any trade deal with a country that is treating its people in the way that China is?
I think, again, I think it is important that we do have good trade with many different partners around the globe. And those are our considerations that we can have as we work through a trade deal. I believe it's the Admiral that said we do want to encourage competition, but we expect that people we do business with will follow the same norms and standards that maybe we do in the United States or globally. And so we would expect better out of the Chinese. Now, will that happen? What are the ways that we can enforce what we want to see when it comes to Hong Kong? And having a number of discussions here at this forum this weekend, just understanding again that there are many tools that exist in a toolbox, whether, you know, at the far end of the spectrum would be military action, which is something we would not want to see. But at the closer end of the spectrum, what can we do through the State Department and enabling some of our partner countries in that region to help them push back against the Chinese? So this is one that we can't go alone, and we certainly would want to work with other nations in that region.
I think even if the administration is unwilling to do more than just admire authoritarian leaders, as we've seen this administration do, Congress has acted and is standing up for American values. We just passed a Hong Kong sanctions, basically sanctioning anybody who is engaged in human rights violations. That has real teeth, and it passed with a veto-proof majority. And so I think that Congress also has a role in speaking up, and it has been using its voice and its legislative powers to live true to our American values and to speak up about the situation that is happening in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think what's happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong should send a chill down the spine of everybody outside the borders of China, let alone the Chinese people. What's happening in both places, you know, is demonstrable of what the Communist Party of China is capable of. I think the whole of the international community should be outraged. People are watching Hong Kong quite closely. So there are 100,000 US citizens in Hong Kong, 100,000 British citizens, 30,000 Australians, 25,000 Japanese, 25,000 South Koreans. This is a key financial center for US business and international business to get money into China. It's a key avenue in which money comes out of China as well. For that to come apart would have a global economic impact, certainly affecting everybody's security, and I think the human tragedy that would accompany that would be absolutely alarming. I think you've all read just in the last couple of weeks here that China has been suspending US ship visits to Hong Kong over the course of the last 6 months there. It's just one more indication that the Communist Party of China doesn't live up to its obligations, either by the treaty agreement they had with the transition of Hong Kong or with their own obligations and interactions with the United States. So it's a real problem.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. It's exactly right. I think what happens in Xinjiang and Hong Kong is horrible. I think the international community is looking at it eyes wide open, as we are, and I believe that our values, our friends, partners, and allies that work with us have to continue to push back against that. How you do that, this is, as Senator Ernst said, this is, again, it's not easy in the situation we're in with both Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. But it's something that it should affect all Americans' value system for how bad it is. I do believe, though, exactly what Admiral Davidson said is the rest of the world's seeing this, as are people inside their own country. And so I think we do have to push back, but we've got to do it in the right way, and we've got to do it so that we have an end goal that's success in human rights for those people.
We've had some really good questions come in from the audience, so I definitely want to make some time for those. So anyone can feel free to jump in here. How would a trade agreement with China play out within the US government? Would it pit those who prioritize business and economic interests against national security professionals?
That's a good question, but I would hope that it would benefit both. I think, again, I think when you can be a good trade partner, I do think that it helps bolster national security as well. I would hope that we would be able to achieve both, and that we wouldn't be putting national security interests against our economic desires with any sort of trade agreement. I think we could achieve both, and I hope that we can achieve both. And it is very tricky. We have a lot of unusual relationships with the United States and many other countries, but I think we can achieve both. It's just going to be tricky, and we have to get China to follow, again, by global norms and global standards, and that, to me, will be the hardest part.
The only thing I'd say is I think I agree with the senator. I think it can do both, but I don't trust them. So I think that'd be part of it, frankly. I think that we need to get to a deal, because we do need to help the agriculture. We need to keep working it, but we've got to keep vigilant and alert. Things like CFIUS and FIRMA are incredibly important. The cybersecurity maturity model certification is incredibly important. So, I go back to my earlier statement, they'll give an inch, but they'll try to take two back. So we're just going to have to continue to be vigilant. We're going to have to continue to have safeguards in place so that although we get a deal and we start moving forward, we don't let them retake or we regress into worst case. So I think all the laws and what Congress has done is incredibly important as we move forward in the vigilant side.
We have another question that's pretty interesting. Will the development of 3D printing, automation, and other advanced manufacturing technologies begin to reduce our dependence on Chinese manufacturing? And will a partial decoupling of the US and Chinese economies become possible, Gwyneth Paltrow style? That wasn't in there, but inspired by you.
Well, I think given the trade war that's going on right now is rewiring supply chains as we speak. And I think whether it's finding new sources or using technology to develop the capabilities to replace that, a lot of the businesses are having to do that because there is no end in sight. One thing I would say about the trade deal that we are looking at right now, this what's called phase one, it actually is trading, not implementing tariffs or perhaps lowering a couple of the tariffs that have been implemented for ag products. But there's very little talk about the thing that we started this trade war for, which is those structural changes. And so I think it's critically important that when we talk about de-escalation of this trade war, that we remember why we got into this instead of just being pressed by the pain that's being felt by the farmers who got caught up in the middle of all of this. And I'm not seeing enough of that.
Okay.
On the manufacturing thing, the only thing I'd add to that is I do think that is part of it. We talk about innovation, and most people think of the shiny piece of equipment or the next great technology, but I think it's also innovation in manufacturing. We have a great example, I think, in the T7 and how that came about. I think there's other examples, digital engineering and what digital engineering can do for you in cutting some of the test and evaluation, make the manufacturing, the EMD, engineering, manufacturing, and development part better. So I think, again, I believe that our greatest strength is a creativity and innovation in our people in a free society, and I think that has to apply to manufacturing as well. And that's the way we can start becoming even more competitive against the Chinese, who I think that's part of it, is that innovation in manufacturing as well.
Great. Are we able to show the slide for this panel? I think people at the conference have been talking quite a bit about the fact that the participants in the Reagan National Defense Survey said that they see China as much more of an economic threat than a military threat. And I think a lot of people here, maybe wouldn't agree necessarily with that response. I feel like a lot of people I've talked to just at this event have said these threats are really intertwined. It's hard to separate them. But I guess I was sort of curious, of course China presents an economic threat, but what would be the threat to the US if China's economy actually tanked? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think many people have a super clear picture of what's going on in China's economy. The data is not reliable. There could be quite a bit of stuff going on that we may not have a full picture of. So I was wondering if we could just talk briefly about the risk to the US of a Chinese economic collapse.
I certainly don't think it's the U.S. intention to seek the collapse of the Chinese economy. As I said earlier, I don't think it's the nation's intent to pursue a decoupling as well. I don't think that's in anyone's interest. When I travel around the region, engage with my allies and partners, they're not interested in that either. For many of them, China is their number one trading partner. We, on the other hand, are their number one by an order of magnitude by 10 in many nations. The biggest contributor of foreign direct investment, actual investment in those countries. I don't believe anybody seeks that kind of impact on the Chinese economy as an outcome. But I do think it's important that China's contribution to the global economy and to everybody else's fair treatment and ability to participate in that economy, that they play by the rules. So it's important that we bring them to the table, and that the international community, this is not just a US-China issue, the international community insists that they play by the international rules here when it comes to economic practices.
Right. I mean, yeah, I certainly don't think the US is seeking that outcome, but there's plenty of things going on in China that are totally outside of our control. So I guess I'm curious, if that outcome does come to pass and China's economy really slows down, does that make your job a lot more difficult? Will you be a lot more worried about a China on the defensive than the current position, where I think a lot of people perceive them to be on the rise?
Yeah, I won't take on a hypothetical like that. I mean, I think it's fair for any military man and anybody interested in national security to understand that greater instability in any aspect leads to the greater potential for miscalculation. We'd have to be on the lookout for such a thing, but I won't speculate on the direction of the Chinese economy there.
Anyone else? I think we have 40 seconds.
The only thing I'd say is I couldn't agree more. We're not going to crush, and there's no intention to, and frankly, I don't see it, that they had their worst year in 38 years and their economy grew by 6.9%. So they had to devalue their currency. They'll feel the pain. They have to have that kind of growth to feed 1.4 billion people. So I think the idea that we continue to put pressure on them to force them to change and follow by the rules, the structural changes that the senator and the congresswoman talked about, that's the important part. And I do believe that we as a nation, to include our friends, partners, and allies, have to take the long view, as they do, as our opponent does, and look at this, that this is going to be a continuous competition and engagement, and we've just got to maintain our vigilance and maintain the pressure to get them to follow the rules.
Thank you very much, and we're at time, so thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you.